For the sake of brevity, I've divided this lecture into two parts. This is part B of the Archaic Age. And so the focus is still, how did the economy change during this period? How did warfare evolve? Did it have any connection to economic, social, or political developments? Sparta and Athens both went through important political developments. How was it related to their unique economic and social developments? Okay, what I want to do now is I want to talk about Sparta, one of the two city-states that we're going to look at, the other being Athens, and these are the two most important of the early Greek city-states. Now, Sparta is located in southern Greece on an area called the Peloponnese. Here, and I'll write down Peloponnese. N-N-E-S-E, Peloponnese. And the Peloponnese is this peninsula in southern Greece. The Spartans, like many of the other Greek city-states, went through this process of Synoecism. Synoecism, still can't pronounce it right. And basically the Spartan tribal lands were here in an area called Laconia, and they formed, the various villages formed into the city of Sparta. Now, like other Greek city-states, the Spartans faced the problem of land hunger. They didn't have enough food to feed their inhabitants. And the Spartans came up with a novel solution to this problem. Their solution was not to send out colonies, though they did send out one, but their solution instead was to conquer their neighbors, a group of people called the Messenians. The Spartans fought a series of brutal wars against the Messenians and basically turned them into slaves. The Spartan word for this was helots. And basically what the Messenians had to do now is they had to work on behalf of their Spartan masters. Now, as you can imagine, the Messenians weren't entirely thrilled by this arrangement. They didn't like being slaves to the Spartans and being mistreated by them, and so they would occasionally revolt against the Spartans, and sometimes this got really serious. Now, maybe the ethical thing to do would have been to apologize and say, sorry for the trouble, but the Spartans weren't about to do that. Instead, what the Spartans decided they needed to do is to get really, really tough and really, really prepared. And their solution was basically to turn every single Spartan male into a warrior. All right? So rather than doing any sort of work at all, Spartan males would spend their entirety of their waking hours basically preparing to fight. And all of their food and all of their other needs would be provided by the Messenian slaves. All right? And so they wanted to be incredibly prepared and ready. And so they freed up all citizens, male and female too, by the way, from work and devoted themselves to war full time. Now, this was a pretty big change, and it would require a big social reorganization. Now, part of this was to disintegrate all distinctions between the different classes. As long as you were a Spartan, you were going to be equal. So, the Spartans would actually call themselves equals, and they were to a large degree equal. Each Spartan would be allotted a particular piece of land at birth. Just by being born, you get a big tract of land, and you get helots that are going to work that land for you so that you could devote yourself to the military full time. And the Spartans took this very seriously. They forbid Spartans from handling money. So Sparta didn't have any money. They had gold nuggets that they would use, but there was no real money in Sparta. And it's because they wanted to enforce this social equality that their survival depended on. Now, a big part of this social experiment that the Spartans engaged in was to basically brainwash people, right? How do you take a little child and turn him into a killer? Well, this was thanks largely to the Spartan educational system, which they called the agoge. I'll write that there, agoge, A-O-G-E. The agoge. And this just means training. And basically, the Spartan state controlled people's lives to a very, very high degree. Including when you're born. If you went from the time you were born, they would inspect you to make sure that you were healthy enough and viable enough, and they would actually expose and kill those who weren't healthy enough. Beginning at the age of 7, you would be stripped away from your parents and brought to school. And you can imagine Spartan school was pretty tough. You would be basically instructed by your masters, your teachers, who would beat you and make you go through all sorts of harsh training. You'd be taught to wrestle. You'd be taught to fight. You'd be encouraged to steal. You'd be encouraged to, basically, they wanted to prepare you for a tough, miserable existence. And your entire life was now dedicated to the military. Even as an adult, you became an adult at 20, you still had to live in the barracks with members of your cohort. You were rarely allowed to cohabitate with your wife. You would eat communal meals. And it wasn't really to the age of 60 that you became, that the army was done with you. And you really became a full citizen at that point. And so it's a very harsh and miserable existence in which any types of distinction were stripped away and state ideology was pumped into you. And so really at the end of this, people could call themselves equals. They roughly had the same amount of land and wealth and had gone through this, experience for the entirety of their lives. Now, Spartan political life was also reorganized. I mentioned that in most city-states there weren't kings any longer. Sparta was one of the rare examples. Sparta still kept a king. They kept 2 of them, actually. One would command the army, and the other would supervise the home front. That way, if the one commanding the army was killed, they wouldn't be led without a they wouldn't be left without a king. But we shouldn't imagine that the king, even though they were powerful, real power was in the Council of Elders. And the Spartan Council of Elders was unique in that, in order to be elected into this council, you had to be over the age of 60. Which wasn't all that common to live to. And the reason the Spartans wanted old men there was because they thought that they would probably be the most conservative. You can imagine after going through the agoge and spending this miserable life, you'd probably be pretty grumpy and pretty old. And the Spartans wanted to keep their system grumpy and old. And it's this council of elders that would really determine the law and supervise Spartan society. The Spartans also had an assembly. At the age of 30, when you were considered a full citizen, you were allowed to sit in the council of elders. I mean, in the assembly. You could stand in the assembly, met outdoors. And basically, the assembly did have real power in Sparta. The grumpy old men, the council of elders, they would make the law, but in order for it to become an official law, the Spartan assembly would have to vote on it. So it did have some democratic elements, but the real power was with the grumpy old men, and so the Council of Elders. And so Sparta is also regarded as an oligarchy. Okay, so they're an oligarchy. They're considered an oligarchy, a rule by the few. Okay, and so this is Spartan society. We can see it's kind of a very drastic, pretty unique society, economically, in the sense that everybody had equal amounts of wealth or close to equal. Socially, in the sense that there were no real class distinctions, and not among, at least among Spartans themselves. And politically, there was fairly broad participation, with real power being in the hands of these elders. Okay. What I want to do now is I want to turn to Athens, and as you can see, Athens is located just outside the Peloponnese, in this area of Attica that we talked about. Now, I mentioned that many Greek city-states were having difficulty feeding themselves. Many city-states solved this problem by just exporting their population somewhere else in the form of colonies. Some, like Sparta, attempted conquest of their neighbors, but there was actually a third solution, and that was the Athenian solution, which was commercialization. The Athenians had a hard time feeding their population as well, but what their solution was to turn to trade. The Athenians looked at their soil and they said, yes, it's very poor. We're not going to grow a lot of grain this way. But what we do have is we have great soil for growing olives, so we can make olive oil. And we have great soil for grapes, and so we can make wine, and our craftsmen are good. They'll make pottery and vessels to ship these in, and these will become famous all over the world, and they did. And so Athens turned to selling and buying in order to solve their food needs. And Athens quickly became very rich off of this. Athenian pottery was desired all over the Mediterranean. Their wine and their olive oil was all very much desired, and Athens became very, very rich. And we mentioned that, like many of the other Greek city-states, Athens was an aristocracy. We saw how the towns had formed together, and local elites had formed themselves into this aristocracy. Now, one of the big issues in Athens, and it's an issue that all Greek city-states had to deal with, is this issue of stasis. Stasis is something that you don't want. Stasis means conflict. All city-states had to deal with it. And in the case of Athens, stasis took a couple of different forms. Part of it was aristocratic violence. So various aristocratic cliques would form together, and they would fight each other for office and really trouble the population with their little feuds. The other major issue with stasis was class turmoil. As Athens became richer and richer, many of the poorest Athenians who didn't own any land or owned little land found themselves falling into debt slavery. So they would take out loans. They were unable to pay back these loans, and they'd be forced to sell their children or themselves into slavery. Another issue, another class issue, was the issue of participation in government. Many middle-class people now began to wonder why they didn't have a stake in government. After all, the whole claim to fame of the aristocracy was they were the ones who were the military elites, right? And in the Dark Ages, that was true. But as we saw with the rise of the hoplite, it was the middle class and the aristocracy who defended Athens, right? Remember I mentioned that in the hoplite formation, all military distinction really disintegrated. And so many people in the large middle class, prosperous middle class now, wondered, why don't we have a say in government too, since we are the ones defending it? And so this was an explosive situation between the poor being fallen into debt, between the aristocrats who were out killing each other, and the middle class who wanted a greater stake in government. Very explosive, and on several occasions Athens became a very violent and bloody place as a result of this. Well, the solution would come in two phases. Two great Athenian statesmen that we should examine more closely. The first I want to talk about was Solon. And Solon came along and solved one of these problems, the issue of debt slavery. There were many among the poor who said, we should revolt and redistribute the wealth. We should be like Sparta, Sparta where everybody is equal. Now, naturally, aristocrats and probably middle-class people were not too keen on this idea. And so they called in Solon and said, Solon, solve this problem. You are wise. And Solon's solution was to kind of cut the baby in half, so to speak. He resisted the calls of the poor to redistribute the wealth. And he also resisted the calls of the rich to keep things the way they were. What Solon did, among other things, but really was to give Athenians civil rights. Solon made it illegal to enslave a fellow Athenian and gave them this basic right, the right to freedom. So no longer could you enslave your fellow Athenians. He also eliminated debt for these people, something I think a lot of students would probably like today. Maybe you'll get your Solon one day, I don't know. But he eliminated debts and basically gave people the right to freedom. Now, he didn't outlaw slavery. You could still enslave people, but just people from other tribes and preferably outside of Greece. All right? But as far as Athenians went, they could now rest assured that they weren't going to become slaves to other Athenians. The next phase happened in 507 BC. I think Solon's reforms were in the 580s, and about 2 or 3 generations later, Cleisthenes came. And Cleisthenes solved two of the other problems: middle-class demands for office and power, and aristocratic squabbling for offices. And basically what he did is he created a system in which each Athenian male, regardless of class, would have the ability to govern. Now, if you remember the word for the people in Athens, the word is demos. We know that if we take the word krussi or archi and we put it with the word that comes before it, means rule by. And so the system that Cleisthenes created was called democracy, a word we're all familiar with. Athens' democracy was pretty unique, though. Cleisthenes wanted to create a council of elders, so to speak, who would make up law, a small body of sorts, who would make up laws. They would draft laws, we would say. This was the Council of 500. Now, what's unique about this council is who gets to sit in it. Cleisthenes wanted to make it so that each Athenian would, at some point in their lives, most likely get a chance to sit in government, become a member of this council. And what he came up with was a pretty novel solution. The Council of 500 when you get elected, you would sit for 1 year in office. You get to be in the council for 1 year. But the way you got into the council was pretty unique. It was basically by lottery. All regions of Athens would have to submit names of their inhabitants and citizens, and they would randomly select 500 out of them to be the government for that year. Now, this sounds maybe a little bit crazy to us, but, you know, maybe not so crazy. You look at some of our government officials and you may say, well, I think a random person on the street could probably do a better job. And so it was nuts, but that was the Athenian system, to randomly select people for 1 year. And then after the year, your name got taken out of the lottery and you weren't eligible for many years later. The hope is that each member of every citizen in Athens would at some point in their life get a chance to be in government. Okay, so this council, oh, and by the way, by having it randomly selected, it meant that aristocrats couldn't put pressure on people, they couldn't fight amongst themselves. It was just a random thing that you got to be in government. And so this solved the problem of aristocrats killing each other in the streets for power, and made sure everybody got a chance. In addition to this, there was also the Athenian assembly. And in the assembly, all male citizens got the right to partake of the assembly whenever it met. What did the assembly do? Well, the assembly's important job was to ratify, that is, to make valid the laws that the council passed. And so the council could draft a law, but it didn't officially become a law until the assembly passed it. So it would go from the council to the assembly. The council would create the law, the assembly would pass the law, and then once the assembly okayed it, it would officially become a law. I should mention it still kept different officers too. So there was an army officer, there was maybe a religious officer, there was other officers, and these were elected by the assembly. So they didn't want to just leave it to chance to say, okay, we're at war, let's have a lottery, and so, whoever we randomly select is going to be general. They wanted to keep this somewhat professionalized. And so some of these offices would become, these were elected. Okay. So this is a pretty unique system, and I guess it's time for an evaluation of it. This Athenian democracy, which is so important. Well, the first thing we should, when evaluating, talk about who wasn't included in democracy. We hear power to the people, democracy, rule by the people. It's important to remember that the Athenians didn't consider everybody the people. Who was excluded? Slaves are excluded. Resident foreigners. If you lived in Athens, but you weren't an Athenian, you were excluded. You say, well, but I was born here. Didn't matter. You needed to have 2 Athenian parents to be an Athenian. And so people lived for generations in Athens who were never citizens. Women. Women were technically citizens, but they were what is called passive citizens. They weren't allowed to partake in government. And so all of these people were excluded. So, when we talk about democracy, we're maybe talking, 20, 30% of the population. But, and this sounds, bad to us as moderns, where that doesn't sound very democratic. But we have to keep it in context. If you think about Egypt at this time, with pharaohs ruling, or Mesopotamia, where kings ruled, this was pretty inclusive. In all of these other places, law and government were controlled by the gods, or by priests or kings. It came from high up, and the rest of the people had to just live with it. But in Greece, it was the citizens themselves that made their own laws. They determined how they would live. They determined what their lives were going to be like. And this is why this is such an important development in the history of Western civilization. Okay, so that ends the second part, Part B of the Archaic Age. Again, our focus questions are: how did the economy change during this period? How did warfare evolve? Did it have any connection to economic, social, and or political developments? Sparta and Athens both went through important political developments. How was it related to their unique economic and social developments?